Hello and welcome to a special episode of another History of the World. Today we're going to be talking about Invasion Day. On the morning of 26 January 1788, Sir Arthur Phillip claimed the land of Australia in the name of King George III. He led the first fleet. Europeans had explored the shores of Australia previously. In 1606, Dutch and Spanish explorers navigated islands around Australia, and Lieutenant James Cook made a 1770 voyage, after which Sir Joseph Banks recommended Botany Bay, which is near present-day Sydney, as a suitable site for a colony. The decision to establish a colony in Australia was made by Thomas Townshend, 1st Viscount Sydney. This was taken for two reasons: the ending of transportation of criminals to North America after the American Revolution, as well as the need for a base in the Pacific to counter the French Empire. Sir Arthur Phillip had the authority from the British Empire to claim the land of Australia on the basis of terra nullius, or no man's land. But Indigenous peoples have never ceded sovereignty, and Australia is built on stolen land. And far from running away from the British, Indigenous peoples fought back. British settlers who explored the continent wrote inaccurate and demeaning observations of Indigenous peoples, which has led to current stereotypes of tribes of Indigenous peoples being hunter-gatherers, despite archaeological evidence of their sophisticated agricultural and aquacultural farming techniques, along with their use of fire management. On 26 January 1972, 4 First Nations men set up a beach umbrella on the lawns opposite Parliament House in Canberra. This sit-in protest, called the Aboriginal Embassy, was symbolic of the fact that the government had made Indigenous peoples aliens in their own land, and Australia Day was not celebrated on 26 January as an official public holiday until 1994. Devastating violence occurred on the Australian frontier. Historians, archaeologists, artists and descendants have all gathered evidence of mass killings from 1788 until 1928, a sustained and systematic process of conflict and expansion, and of massacres, genocide and dispossession. Still, we do not have even remotely precise figures for the number of deaths of Indigenous peoples, and often oral history has been dismissed by the lack of written records. Protection legislation in the various colonies provided for the rounding up of Indigenous peoples, so-called half-castes and their associates, and they were confined on reserves which were frequently administered by the missions. In other cases, children were taken away from their parents and raised with white parents in order to civilize them. These are the stolen generations. The Assimilation Policy was formally announced by Paul Hasluck, the Federal Minister for Northern Development, in 1951, and had the goal that all persons of Aboriginal birth or mixed blood in Australia will live like white Australians do, and resulted in the welfare ordinances. Indigenous people were granted the right to vote in Australia in all jurisdictions in 1962, with the passing of the Commonwealth Electoral Act, but enrolment to vote was not compulsory, despite being compulsory for all other Australians in elections since 1924. In 1967, Australians voted to amend the Constitution to include Aboriginal Indigenous Australians in the census and allow the Commonwealth to create laws for them. The official policy of self-determination was announced by the Whitlam government in 1972, and by the time of the Howard government in 2000, reconciliation was the word of the day. From 2008, closing the gap targets have been created by the federal government, with 11 reports released. National Surrey Day, or the National Day of Healing, is an annual event that has been held in Australia on 26 May since 1998, to remember and commemorate the mistreatment of the country's Indigenous peoples as part of an ongoing process of reconciliation. It was first recognised after the Bringing Them Home report was tabled in Parliament, which recommended an apology to the stolen generations. Prime Minister John Howard refused to apologise, but Kevin Rudd issued a formal apology on behalf of the government and people when he was Prime Minister on 13 February 2008.